Okay, we can get started. We could have the first staff presentation, please.
All right, I guess I get to start. Good afternoon. I want to thank the commissioners and staff for giving me a few minutes to talk today. It's my first time doing this. My name is Paul Weiss. I am the division chief for the forestry section in the Bureau of Wildlife Habitat Management. And I would like to talk to you a bit today about the idea of introduction of the DMAP program on state game lands. Just for a little bit of background information, the DMAP program is the Deer Management Assistance Program. It is in place to allow landowners to manage deer to meet their land use needs. Public landowners, public subdivisions, government agencies, private landowners, and leasees and hunting clubs are eligible to enroll in DMAP for additional doe tags to manage deer to meet their goals. Currently, there are three major public landowners in Pennsylvania. On the map here, you're looking, green is DCNR. They're currently eligible and use the DMAP program on their lands. Blue is the Forest Service Allegheny National Forest. They are currently eligible and use DMAP on Forest Service lands. And the orange blocks are Game Commission state game lands, currently not enrolled in the DMAP program. In addition to the large public land ownerships, there are multiple large private forest land ownerships, especially across the northern tier. They're enrolled in DMAP. Places like Collins Pines, also known as Cane Hardwood, Lime Timber. Between the two of them, they're the two largest private landowners in Pennsylvania, and their lands are eligible to be enrolled, and they have quite a bit of their land enrolled in it. To give a little bit of example of how the interaction of game lands is with properties that are eligible for DMAP. Here we're looking at some of the north central region game lands. All of the orange on here are the game lands you're looking at are suffering from extensive overbrowsing impacts, and it's negatively impacting our ability to successfully manage the habitat for multiple wildlife species. As you can see on here, State Game Lands 34 is completely surrounded by DCNR Bureau of Forestry lands. And those lands are all enrolled in the DMAP program. State Game Lands 100 on the east, the right side there, and 14 up north. They both share significant boundaries with DCNR, and the Bureau of Forestry is the dominant landmass around them. And they are all enrolled in the DMAP program. And especially at Game Lands 100, 14, 34, and 90, we're looking at significant overbrowsing problems, where we are struggling to grow anything that deer prefer to eat. In many cases, a lot of the landscape is dominated by food that is not preferred by deer. So this means in areas where we have significant overbrowsing problems, oftentimes the hunters are incentivized to hunt on lands surrounding game lands because of the additional tags and opportunities available to the hunter population. In the Allegheny National Forest area, Game Lands 29 and Game Lands 28 are both what would be considered in-holdings within the National Forest, completely surrounded by lands enrolled in the DMAP program. Game Lands 24, the triangle down there in the south, has National Forest to the north, and most of the rest of the boundary is shared with Collins Pine land, which is enrolled in the DMAP program as well. And we have begun within the last few years, especially on these game lands further north, to see significant overbrowsing pressure on these game lands. And what we're seeing is hunter pressure is being focused a lot of times on lands other than game lands because of the availability of tags. Just a little bit of the impacts of overbrowsing. The picture there on the right is from State Game Lands 33, from not this past spring, but the spring before. What you're looking at there are the remnants of the laurel. That was the only thing left green in that area that was within deer's height, and that was the year that we had a lot of snow, and the deer ate the laurel to the ground because they had already eaten everything else that was within reach at the time. I did not realize this till I had taken that picture and talked to our deer biologist. Laurel is toxic to deer. So they don't eat that till they've exhausted their food source of everything else, and then they eat it because it's green. And at times, if they eat enough of it, it will be fatal. So that's just something to keep in mind when we see pictures of them eating laurel. The biggest issue we have with the excessive browsing is it impacts our ability to manage for quality habitat for a wide range of species that rely on that early successional or young forest condition. So species like ruffed grouse, Appalachian cottontail, snowshoe hares, golden winged warblers, and even turkey to an extent because of their nesting conditions rely on that shrubby cover that is difficult to provide with overbrowsing. And as far as grouse go, lack of quality habitat is one of the driving factors for the decline of grouse population. The West Nile virus exacerbates the problem even more when you have both of them. That's why the GPAS tool, the grouse sighting tool, was developed to locate the areas that are most suitable for grouse habitat to negate the effects of West Nile. We are seeing extreme difficulty in finding success in creating quality grouse habitat in the face of excessive browsing. Browsing is often focused on tree species that in their mature level are very desirable for their wildlife benefits, species like oak, cherry, aspen, multiple mass-producing shrubs, so they never get to the point of being their maximum potential for wildlife. So within the forestry program on state game lands, most of our management activity is within what we call the mixed successional type. This is the forest management that is traditionally known as even-aged that are geared towards successfully regenerating stands because we're trying to balance the age classes in order to provide a multitude of habitat conditions as the forest ages. And a big part of this is the early successional forest habitat that we hear about, especially for grouse. Overbrowsing negatively impacts our ability to manage in that way. We cannot successfully reestablish new age classes and get them through if we cannot get the seedlings past deer height. Another type of management that we focus on heavily is what we call late successional forest. We're trying to develop and maintain structurally diverse and healthy mature forests that are healthy in the canopy, as well as having that shrub layer or mid-story and understory layer that is quality for a wide range of wildlife. We're suffering under the overbrowsing impacts because we can't get that lower layer developed before it gets out of browse. We're spending an excessive amount of resources, both time, energy, and money, in trying to overcome the results of this browsing issue. Over the last 2 years, deer fence installation has risen by nearly 50%, and we're looking at over $4 a linear foot. What that actually comes down to is we're looking at roughly $579 an acre to put up deer fence. So far this year, as far as fiscal year 22, timber sale revenues generate $626 per acre. So it's practically a wash at that point in trying to create habitat. So if we were to introduce and enroll game lands into the DMAP program, it would be a very targeted approach. As of right now, the checklist that you're looking there on the right was originally developed as a checklist for installing deer fences on game lands. And we would go through a very similar process to identify individual targeted game lands that would fall into this request. We would not be looking broad scale just on areas where we have the impact that we're really struggling to overcome. And we would look at all other options to be exhausted before we would go down this route for an individual game lands. Opening roads, intensive management, deer hunter focus areas, fencing where possible. And any application for state game land to be enrolled in DMAP, we would be consistent with the application for other public land ownership process. We would have the plan in place that other public land ownerships use. I have time for some questions. I just wanted to talk about this picture a little bit. This is actually from yesterday on State Game Lands 100. This is an area that was the result of the aftermath of the 2006 through 2009 gypsy moth outbreak, where they had to salvage through what was, out of our control at the time. This area has been herbicided, I believe, twice, has had a prescribed fire through it, and has been salvaged. So you can see there's obviously light conditions there that should allow something to grow. If you stand up there and you spin in a circle as far as you can see, there is nothing taller than the height of the fern. If you dig down through the fern, there is red maple knee high, and it's about as big around as my thumb, but it can't get above the fern. We were on Game Lands 100 yesterday. We saw about 2,000 acres that looked like that. So, any questions?
Thank you for that. I know we had a tour last year on Game Lands 100, and I was blown away that the amount of impact that deer were having. So as a wildlife biologist, I kind of thought for most of the times that fern kept regeneration from coming, but fern in the instance of Game Lands 100 is the only thing that allows red maple to get above, an inch. And at that point, that red maple is only safe until it peaks its little terminal bud up outside of the fern. So I think this is a tool that will be very, very useful for our land managers within this agency. And I think it's also extremely important to convey to the public that this is a tool that's going to be used to continue managing our game lands in a sustainable manner, both for wildlife and for our forestry program. Because if you can't grow trees there right now, not only do you not have a future forest to cut, but you don't have quality habitat for any wildlife, deer or otherwise. So I think this is a fantastic step, and I'm looking forward to kind of watching this throughout the next few years and watch some game lands come in and some game lands go out, and watch the ebb and flow of the way wildlife management is supposed to be on a very dynamic scale.
You brought up a line there that I actually used yesterday when I was with the staff on the game lands looking at these, because some of these areas, they have that low density kind of a grassland feel to them, which are very neat looking right now. The problem is they have no future, because they're grasslands underneath a low density red maple forest, and we can't even get red maple seedlings established. And for those unaware, Game Lands 100 seems to sit in the part of the state that every time there's a wave of whether non-native or native insect defoliators, it takes the brunt of it every time. No matter where the wave comes, eventually it ends up hitting there. So we're in a position where we will eventually lose those overstory trees to situations that are out of our control, to insects and disease. It just does happen. Those stands where we cannot get anything established in that grass layer underneath, they have no future as a forest right now. And we still have a couple of years before we lose it totally, but I can see the train coming down the track in some of those stands.
Paul, can you briefly give us a little history of yourself since you're new to us?
Sure. I became the chief forester in March, so I've been here for 6 months as the chief. I joined the Game Commission in 2018 as the silvicultural specialist working out of Howard. Prior to that, I spent 10 years at DCNR as a forest health specialist, and prior to that, right out of college, I spent about 7 years in private industry working for Keith Horn Incorporated out of Kane, Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Scott Baer. I'm similarly new, relatively new. This is my first presentation to the commissioners, so thank you for having me. There has been, by way of introduction, again, Scott Baer, Division Chief of Habitat Planning and Development. Many of you have heard about the partnerships and collaborations we've been having with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So about a month ago, something great happened, and we thought now would be a good time to get in front of you all and give you an update on where we're at and kind of review our history of our partnership with this group called NIFWIF. So we wanted to just take a few minutes to do that. So if you're not familiar with NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, their mission is dedicated to sustaining and restoring and enhancing the nation's fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats for current and future generations. So already off the bat, you can see the synergy that this foundation has with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. The approach of NIFWIF, the way they accomplish this is primarily through partnerships with U.S. corporations, foundations, state and federal agencies, and a bunch of others. Now, instead of me kind of giving you the overview, I thought I'd take a few minutes and play their introductory video that gives a better sense of who they are.
Every day, salmon swim upstream, and flowers are pollinated. Every day, rivers run, songbirds sing, and bears roam. But what happens when the wild is threatened? Actually, before we go there, what happened in 1984?
1984? Wait, I think I read that book.
Oh yeah, me too.
Really bad hair.
That's true. But wasn't there that famous Apple Macintosh commercial with the... Wait a minute. That's not where we're going with this. In 1984, Congress created what would become one of the largest conservation grant makers in the country, the National Fish...
Sorry, actually, we're sort of the largest private conservation grant maker in the United States. You said one of.
Oh, right. Thanks. Since 1984, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, known as NIFWIF, has supported conservation efforts in all 50 states and U.S. territories. From the farms of Pennsylvania to the forests of California, NIFWIF has become one of our planet's most important actors. Their projects protect and restore our nation's fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats for generations to come. Take, for instance, the sprawling urban...
Hey, you're taking too long. We work in cities funding things like green roofs and rain gardens to reduce stormwater runoff. And we show the next generation of conservationists how to create habitat for urban wildlife. And you'll find us in rural communities, working with farmers to keep cows out of streams, reducing erosion and improving water quality in order to create better habitat for native fish. Hi.
We work with ranchers to modify fences to help pronghorn and mule deer complete their annual migrations. We use all the tools on the ranch to help wildlife, including drones.
When storms threaten our coasts and communities, we work to strengthen natural defenses. Like this, we planted all of this to protect those communities while benefiting vital habitat for fish and wildlife.
When fire consumes the forest, we work with the U.S. Forest Service to help restore watersheds, recover infrastructure, and improve forest health in these critical landscapes.
Wait a minute. You got government, nonprofit, corporations, and individuals to work together? Solving conservation challenges? How?
Everybody working in conservation knows NIFWIF brings all parties to the table. We're a neutral, science-based nonprofit. We put boots on the ground for conservation, and we get results.
We focus on developing public-private partnerships that advance the cause of conservation, one project at a time.
And these partnerships allow us to match public funding with private dollars to implement conservation at a landscape scale.
And we don't support advocacy or litigation. Now, did you tell them about the dogs yet?
The dogs? What dogs?
Like these dogs, using their amazing sense of smell to locate killer whale scat, helping scientists learn more about the health of these animals without having to disturb them.
Wait, scat? So the dogs are smelling it? Oh.
And we work with the U.S. Army to protect pollinators and support the communities that depend on them.
We are bees and butterflies! And bats! Don't forget the bats! And don't forget about Alaska. NIFWIF partners with federal agencies and educators to spark and support interest in hands-on conservation among Alaska Native youth.
That is only 9 projects. 9! The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has funded more than 18,000 other projects and generates more than $500 million in conservation impact each year. What does that mean? It means our songbirds will sing, our rivers will run, and the wild places we value most aren't going anywhere. So, again, what happened in 1984? Something awesome.
So like I said, they could do it a lot better than I could. But I do want to focus in on the work that we are doing. From that video you saw what NIFWIF does. They hold out a bucket and various foundations, corporations put money into that bucket and then they move it out to their priorities. If you look at a few of their corporate partners, you can see this is just a screen capture of some of them, but you have a whole variety of partners that are corporate partners that are bringing money to the table. Similarly, foundations like the Bezos Earth Fund or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation bringing money to that NIFWIF bucket. And then what NIFWIF does with their bucket is they have their priority landscapes. For us, if you focus on that top line, you have the Central Apps, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Delaware River. Certainly a lot of overlap with the work that the Game Commission is doing. If you go to their page, nifwif.org, where we work, you can see, and I realize you guys can't see that number up in the Mid-Atlantic Northeastern, but there's about 7,000 projects. Zooming in, what you see is about 1,500 projects that NIFWIF has funded with partners in the state of Pennsylvania. So again, if you look at where their priority landscapes are, you begin to see the synergy with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Their priorities in the Central Apps, the Chesapeake, and the Delaware River. So because of our shared priorities, we have partnered with a variety of NGOs that are listed here on the right to do a variety of partner projects in these 4 categories: land protection, aquatic organism passage, grassland conservation, and forest conservation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through the first 3, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into that 4th one. So just 2 days ago, in the land protection world, we found out that the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, with support from the Pennsylvania Game Commission, was awarded close to $500,000 that they're going to move that towards protecting lands that are important for areas of habitat connectivity. This is their habitat connectivity map. That's an iteration from some of the work that was done by the Nature Conservancy and others 10 years ago, but that's where they're going to be focusing their land protection work. So NIFWIF is bringing money to the table for land protection. Looking at aquatic organism passage, if you're not familiar with these kinds of projects, you start out with that photo that's on the left there where you can imagine your aquatic species like your brook trout or your northern water shrews. They can't access those upstream habitats because of that separation, that obstruction from that raised culvert. What we do with these AOP projects is essentially what we're doing is we're ripping out those culverts, and in its place we're putting these timber deck bridges so that species that rely on these aquatic habitats can access those upstream habitats. So again, in partnership with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, they received $500,000 that is now funding work on state game lands. So WPC is the awardee, they're getting the money, but that work is happening on game lands. With grassland habitats, we have over $4.5 million that we're currently requesting from NIFWIF. I will say we haven't been awarded this funding yet, but it's in partnership with Pheasants Forever. The idea being that we're going to be focused on grassland habitat, not only anchored on state game lands, but also allow us through this partnership, allow us to do grassland habitat work on private lands that surround our important game lands for grasslands. So The fourth category of projects that we've been working with NIFWIF on and received funding from are our forested habitats. So PGC has partnered with the American Bird Conservancy and IUP and the Rough Grouse Society and others to receive approximately $4.5 million in NIFWIF funding alone for forest habitat projects. Now, the majority of that funding has gone to state game lands to do non-timber sale, non-commercial kind of work on state game lands in partnership with our staff. So very exciting how that's gone. And I know Dr. Jeff Larkin, who is our biggest partner in a lot of this work, I know he was here a moment ago. Jeff, raise your hand. Dr. Larkin wears two hats, one with the American Bird Conservancy and one with IUP. And Dr. Larkin has been one of our biggest supporters and has really championed and led a lot of this forest habitat work. So to give you a little bit of background, before we moved into the NIFWIF mechanism, Dr. Larkin and the Pennsylvania Game Commission and others had partnered to start doing this work that was really focused on golden wing warbler habitat. A lot of this work was funded using NRCS dollars and the Working Lands for Wildlife, and a lot of substantial amounts of habitat work for early successional habitat occurred on game lands and partnering private lands. So you can see over 14,000 acres of golden wing warbler habitat. That was then transferred over to a later successional species for the cerulean warblers, and again using a similar mechanism, NRCS dollars. The RCPP accomplished over 6,000 acres on game lands and private lands. And then of course we moved in 2017, a few years after that, into this concept of the dynamic forest restoration blocks. And so far we have over 14,000 acres included in those dynamic forest restoration blocks, and that NIFWIF funding is going to habitat projects in those areas. So I had alluded to this earlier, but about a month ago, NIFWIF made the announcement that they are advertising their funds, or they made the awards for their Delaware River watershed grants. This is one of the biggest grants NIFWIF has ever provided, and you can see close to $16 million in conservation funds from NIFWIF going to Delaware River watershed projects. A little over $7 million of those dollars came to Pennsylvania, and our dynamic forest partnership with Dr. Larkin, the Game Commission, and others was awarded $1.4 million in NIFWIF funding. So one of the largest awards that NIFWIF has ever given came to a partnership that the Game Commission and the Dynamic Forest Partnership, American Bird Conservancy, IUP, were awarded. So it's very exciting. Where are these projects happening? You can see the majority of the dynamic forest restoration blocks are state game lands. So this work is happening on state game lands, but you can see there are also other partners in there. Bureau of State Parks is a big partner. And then we're moving into the stage where we're also, now that we're at phase 6, especially of this Delaware River grant, we're moving into the private lands that surround our important game lands. So not only are we doing the forest conservation work, we're also starting this whole effort with our game lands management plans. We start there. From that, we move to the landscape and develop these landscape comprehensive management plans. And this shows where that forest inventory work is done. We also combine that with avian monitoring, where we work to see what does the suite of birds look like, where the work is happening in these dynamic forest restoration blocks. And this, of course, ties into the work that wildlife management is doing before we do the implementation to see what the avian response is. So I don't know, Sean, if you're going to be talking about the ARU work, but there's a lot of synergy with the work that is happening with these NIFWIF projects and the work that wildlife management is doing here. And then, of course, we do the implementation of the habitat work. To give you a sense of where some of these areas are, here's the Poconos birdscape. You can see over 130,000 acres that are included in this dynamic forest restoration block. And up to date, we have over 4,500 acres treated across that landscape, just in the Poconos, using that NIFWIF funding. So here's how the numbers break down, the financial numbers from 2017 to 22 in the Delaware River. NIFWIF has brought over $3 million of their foundation money to help us manage our habitats. In the Central Appalachians, we have $1.3 million of NIFWIF funding. And of course, again, this is a partnership with a whole variety of partners coming to the table. So totally what we have for NIFWIF funding is $4.3 million of NIFWIF funds coming to help the Game Commission assist with our management, not only on game lands, but surrounding areas of importance as well, state parklands, private lands. Now we're moving into the phase, as I had mentioned, especially with this last award, where we're not only anchoring our habitat management work on game lands, but we also want to explore the opportunities on priority private lands that can help us connect habitats. So, you know, with this last Delaware River Watershed Grant, the $1.4 million NIFWIF award, we're going to be working with our hunter access properties to see if there's opportunities there to do good habitat management work on those lands as well. So in summary, the Game Commission currently has a whole variety of partnerships that have received over $5 million in NIFWIF funding across those four categories. If the grassland conservation one is awarded, we should find out in the next month or so, that will bump that up significantly. So a very exciting time with our partnership at the Dynamic Forest Partnership and our collaboration with NIFWIF. Certainly the Dynamic Forest Partnership has been our most successful partnership with NIFWIF, $4.3 million in NIFWIF funds received. And then of course we're going to be continuing this work as best we can. So thanks to all of our partners and especially NIFWIF for their funding. And I didn't want to go without saying thanks to our forestry and land management staff, because the regional staff really are the ones who are implementing this work. They're carrying a huge burden to get this work on the ground. So kudos to them, and certainly appreciate everybody's hard work. That's all I had. Thank you. I'll take any questions. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Williams, the Division Chief for the Wildlife Recovery Division. I've been here for about a year, just about a year and a month right now in this Recovery Division position. And you may know it formally as the Wildlife Diversity Division. And the term wildlife diversity really signified the fact that conserving multiple species is important. So wildlife diversity makes sense. I put a little different spin on it, a little different point on the issue, and we've done a lot of visioning within our division, and we have really sort of taken a focus on active wildlife recovery. So now you know us as the Wildlife Recovery Division, really focusing on priorities, active recovery, because a lot of these species don't have time to waste. So a little bit of a name change and a little bit of a paradigm shift within our division. So I'm excited to talk to you about how wildlife recovery works in our division, but first I want to take a minute to introduce you to the small but mighty team. If you count me, there are 6 of us in the division. If you think about the people who actually get the work done, it's these 5. So Sean Murphy is the state ornithologist. Patty Barber works under Sean in that section as the threatened and endangered bird biologist. We have Greg Turner, who is the state mammalogist and the section supervisor for mammals. Mike Scaffini works with Greg as the threatened and endangered mammal biologist. And Kathy Hafner is sort of an island and a powerhouse unto herself in the planning and grants administration section. And Kathy, you may know her, you may recognize her name on emails. She is the architect and the coordinator for the State Wildlife Action Plan and has been integral in really supporting Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which would invest significant funding into these recovery efforts. It's important to have a state wildlife action plan that prioritizes species and threats and actions because we have hundreds within our division. We have everything from meadow voles, which are so common that they support entire wildlife communities in some areas, to northern goshawk, where you can count the number of nests in Pennsylvania on one hand. We have that whole spectrum of species and pretty much everything in between. Now, why do we have hundreds of species in one division? It really comes back to this really critical piece of the equation, which is that the Game Commission is a public trust agency. The Constitution of Pennsylvania says that natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. And as trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. And from that comes our mission statement: manage and protect wildlife and their habitats while promoting hunting and trapping for current and future generations. That's a huge mandate. It's terrifying sometimes, but it's really an honor to also have that public trust bestowed upon us as an agency. When I think about our mission and our sort of life's work, I tend to shorten it in my mind to, we are responsible in the Game Commission for all birds and all mammals and their habitats, for all people, for all time. Like, no big, no pressure. It is terrifying and it is sometimes stressful, but again, it is such an honor. And that's how you end up with hundreds of species in one division. So we have about 480 birds and mammals in Pennsylvania. 423 of them are not hunted. So roughly 88% of those species are not hunted. They fall within our division. We are not chasing down 423 species on a species by species basis. It just wouldn't be possible. So many of those, hundreds of those species, we manage based on quality habitat. You take good care of the habitat. You heard Paul talk about, you heard Scott talk about really paying attention to high quality habitat, and you're supporting hundreds of species in the process. It is the most efficient way to maintain and recover species. We do, though, have 131 species that we consider recovery priority. So we still have a pretty heavy load in the division. These recovery priority species are ones that are threatened or endangered, or they're on their way to those lists. They're species that are declining that we're concerned about, or they may be a pretty common species, like the wood thrush or the catbird, and they're on our list as recovery species because we need to pay attention to them, because maybe 10 to 20% of their global population occurs in Pennsylvania. 10 to 20% of the global population is here in our forests. So that again is a huge responsibility. If we lose them here, if they start slipping away from us here, they're in big trouble across the country and across the world. So that's how you end up on the recovery priority list if you're a species. Once you decide that we have these priority species, then the recovery itself gets very complicated. And you guys all know this. We're thinking about species, we're thinking about their interaction with their habitat. We have to identify threats. What's the scope? What's the scale? What's the immediacy of those threats? How might different threats be interacting with one another? A lot of those questions take research, so sometimes we have to slow down, step back, do the necessary research so that we know we understand the problem before we take recovery actions. Taking that time to do the research, to understand the system, means that when we take an action, it's efficient and it's going to be effective. So once we do that, then we monitor to see if we're getting the response that we expected, to see if the species really are stabilizing or recovering. It's a complex situation, and it really requires two things: collaboration and patience. Collaboration, because no one person can handle all of this for one species, let alone groups of species. So we collaborate with the region staff. We have biologists in every region. We have supportive region directors who are lifting a lot of the heavy work in the field on these recovery actions. We cooperate with universities, with other agencies, with conservation partners. So collaboration is really key to getting any progress in this sort of mess of recovery. The other thing that it requires a lot of is patience. It's important to know that this stuff doesn't happen fast. You are not going to stabilize and turn around a species quickly. It can take years, it can take decades. In this example with bats, you lost 90% of your population and you only have one pup per year. It may take centuries before we see true stability and recovery in those species. So given how complex it is, we go through another round of prioritization, and I'm just going to highlight sort of the three types of intervention that we think about when we're thinking about these declining species. The first and best is always preventive care. That's when you're working up front, you're working when you still have plenty of animals left that can respond. It's an efficient and effective way to get the work done. And that's often monitoring so that we know when a problem starts to arise, and it is always habitat. Good, high-quality habitat is what's needed if we're talking about early intervention and getting involved with recovering these species. If a species continues to decline, and now we're in this sort of active intervention stage, which is still habitat, this is a lot of what Scott was talking about with NIFWIF. We're reaching out to partners to really get focused good habitat on the ground. But we might also then start initiating research projects to understand the problem and to understand the threats. So at that active intervention stage, we're getting more species specific. And then finally, when a species flatlines, and this is poor Jeff Larkin's golden wing warbler, when you get to a species that's flatlining, you're in the emergency room. You know, really emergency response. You are throwing a lot at almost individual species. Now, if you're doing that in the sense of NIFWIF, if you're doing that at the habitat level, you know you're supporting others. But a lot of the work has to be focused specifically on that emergency room species and their particular threats, their particular needs. Just like human health, you don't want to end up in the emergency room. It tends to be more expensive, it's more intensive, it's way more stressful, and your chances of a good outcome are slimmer than if you had been able to intervene earlier. We are in the process in the division of hiring 2 recovery biologists, one for birds and one for mammals, so they can take that focus on those emergency room species and free up some time among our staff so that they can start working up front and continue to work up front where we're more efficient at that active intervention or the preventative care stage. And then if you go beyond flatline and you lose the species in Pennsylvania, sometimes you have a chance to restore them or reintroduce them. If the conditions that caused them to disappear in the first place have been addressed, if the habitat is there to support them, you can get this second chance with some species. Some of the most famous examples and the ones we're very proud of in the Game Commission are, of course, the work we did with bald eagle and with elk. Otter, you may still see an otter license plate sometimes when you're driving down the highway. These species tend to get a lot of public support. They sort of capture the imagination of the public, and they become almost poster children for successful conservation. It's interesting when I go to other states, a lot of other state agencies are content to just document the decline. They're just content to count noses until the species is gone. And it's gratifying in these meetings in other states that the Game Commission has a reputation for getting in there and getting stuff done, for rolling up our sleeves, getting our hands dirty in conservation, being willing to take a chance, adapt, repeat, and a lot of states are, a lot of state agencies kind of watch us to see what we're doing. And they're kind of waiting, playing it safe, watching to see what we're doing so that they can quickly adapt it and adopt it for their own state. I see that a lot with Greg and Sean's work. We think of Greg and Sean as like these guys down the hallway, but when you go to other states, you realize that a lot of people are watching to see what they're doing because they're going to copy it. So we're a leader. We continue to be a leader in recovering these species, whether it's at the regional or national level. So the other part of that mission is for current and future generations, and that too is a huge mandate. I mean, that also needs prioritization. We in the Recovery Division have long-standing relationships with wildlife watchers, wildlife viewers, and I think that's a good first step in prioritizing how we attack that part of the mandate, current and future generations. Over a third of Pennsylvanians are wildlife watchers, 3.6 million people. That's about 35% of the state. They share our values. Survey after survey shows that they align very closely with our values, with the values of hunters. They're passionate about wildlife and conservation, and they support our work, but they might not know us. They might, if you ask people who manages birds and mammals in Pennsylvania, you may get a variety of answers: state parks, state forests, Department of Ag. If you ask people, what does the Game Commission do? You'll get a variety of answers. They're the hunting organization, or they manage casinos. You know, there is a lack of recognition and relevancy even among these people who completely share our conservation passion. I think we can help with that in the Recovery Division. We have these long-standing relationships, particularly with bird watchers. We have bat counters. We have people that are providing us data all the time. So we're in the process now of formalizing that, hiring a community science biologist who will work with other bureaus to create opportunities for wildlife viewers to actively support our mission, not just know who we are, Game Commission, but actually take the next step where they're providing us data. They're sending us observations. They're sending us data so that we can make better management decisions. So not just knowing who we are, but supporting us in our mission. Again, current to future generations, it's a big ask and it's a big task. And there are lots of different ways we can sort of try to peel that onion. But one way that we're very excited about right now are looking at the hawk watches that we own, or the hawk watches that we can own. Later in this meeting, you'll be asked to support the transfer of Wagner's Gap Hawk Watch in the South Central region from Audubon to the Game Commission. It's not huge. It's not like a huge typical game lands. It's really focusing on that mission of relevancy to the public. This site gets about 2,000 visitors a year. They come to see the hawks. They come to see the scenery, and they play on the rocks. And it's one of the oldest hawk watches, active hawk watches in Pennsylvania, but it has never had a Game Commission presence. It pulls together our mission of birds and mammals and habitats and present and future generations, but we've never been a player there. They've never seen a badged, logoed person on that mountain routinely that they can ask about deer, or they can ask about hunting, or they can ask about the eagle flying overhead. So I think, again, this is a good way we can start to prioritize that relevancy, that current and future generations part of our mission. It's a tangible, visible example of us reaching out to these audiences and showing them who we are, what we do, and that we share their values. We have this one potentially in the South Central that could be transferred to us, and we have Pete Sussenbach in the Southeast who's getting very active on some of the hawk watches that we already own. So again, it's an investment now. The transfer of Wagner's Gap is no fee, so it's really not an investment except in time. But it will be a way to reach out to those current and future generations. Thank you. I'm not going to take any more time because I want to leave time for Sean and Greg to talk specifics about some of the specific emergency room work that they're doing. But I wanted to give you sort of the landscape of the new old Recovery Division. If there are questions, I'll take them. But
Right. Director Burhans, Commissioners, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be back here. It's been a while, some new faces for me, but I am one of the folks that isn't new around here, I guess. And I got the grays to prove it. Yeah, so today I'm going to focus just a little bit on some of the emergency room things that we've been doing with the mammal section. Lisa gave a nice big intro there and covered a lot of that with the diversity and some of the critical nature of our species. So today I'm going to focus in mainly on bats. Right now we have 2 federally listed bats. We have several more at least a couple more that may be coming down the pipeline as well. So we have 6 hibernating species of bats. 5 of those are state listed, 2 of them are federally listed, and we will probably end up with 4 federally listed species within a year or 2. And that all really happened because of a disease that came through called white nose syndrome. It's a fungus. It's exotic to North America. We don't know exactly where it came from, but when it came in, it was devastating. It killed 99.9% of all of our hibernating bats within 3 to 4 years, statewide. So we saw species just crash. This is an example of some of the monitored sites where we've been monitoring them for 20 plus years. This does not include all of the largest sites. That's not a total bat count in Pennsylvania or anything. This is just a handful of sites that were really important to all species of bats that we were monitoring across the state. And you can just see how quickly those went down. And it was all because of that fungus, as I said, that came in, and we were pretty much blindsided when that came. So a lot of the talks I've given in the past really relate on the doom and gloom when this was all kind of going on. But we had our nose to the grindstone. We were looking at survivors. We were trying to figure out what were they doing, what can we do to help them. So as soon as we could get out of the counting the noses phase and describing how bad the situation was, we were focused on those survivors. And we found a few things. So a lot of these bat species are very gregarious. And so we had hundreds of colonies of little brown bats across the state that we were monitoring, probably close to 300 or so. And that was a lot with our volunteer program called the Appalachian Bat Count that Lisa kind of hinted on. So we watched hundreds of these colonies, some of them upwards of 10,000 bats per colony, just plummet and go down to next to nothing. And when those colonies got really, really small, you have this species that they want to be together. And so certain colonies started to actually grow. And what we represent here, this is 14 different little brown bat colonies that we've been monitoring for the last 5 years, where we go out every year and look at them, and they're growing really, really well. The problem is, what you don't see with a graph like this is that all those other little small ones, they're just being absorbed into those big ones, right? So there is some recovery occurring. Distinguishing that between the aggregation, the movement on the landscape is nearly impossible. But we've never seen growth rates like this before. So we know that a lot of this is just absorbing those small colonies. But we've been managing places and putting up these aluminum shell bat boxes. And the vast majority of our survivors are actually in those aluminum bat boxes as depicted. And then in the winter, of course, we've been monitoring sites since the 1980s as far as the winter goes. And we've also seen the same pattern. We saw bats starting to aggregate at just a couple of sites. So this is 8 of our most important sites currently in the state. And what we see is numbers going up at these sites. Some of the hidden problems with this, though, are that 90% of all of those bats are in just 2 sites. There's also some benefit to that, but having that much of your species in 1 or 2 sites is an inherent risk, because if something were to happen, such as a flood event, which is kind of a natural event that can occur in a cave, that could wipe out half of our survivors in one fell swoop in a matter of just hours. So we're cautiously optimistic about seeing these increases. And we're also studying them, as I said. And one of the things we found out is that those two sites were really, really rare. They're super, super cold sites. So the ground temperature in Pennsylvania is 53 to 55 degrees. These two sites can maintain temperatures about 40 degrees. So they're really, really cold. And that's what the bats were seeking. That's what the survivors were looking for. And the reason they do that is a physiological reason, but why we're more interested in that is because this is the growth pattern of the fungus. It reaches its peak growth about 12 degrees centigrade. And if you move in either direction, warmer or colder from there, it grows slower. So when bats started picking colder sites, one of the things that's intuitive is that they're going to get less disease by doing that. And so where we found these survivors is down here, about 4 degrees centigrade. And where they used to be was about 6-7 degrees centigrade. And so you can see that just cooling a site by a few degrees can have a very significant reduction of disease in those individuals. So we can reduce about 50% of that disease by just cooling it a few degrees. So then we ask the question, well, can we cool a site? And if we cool it, will the bats find it? So we went to a site that we thought was really ideal. It was on state land in the central part of the state, and it had only an open air shaft in the back, and the entrance had been totally plugged many, many decades ago. And so we rappelled in there and worked our way to the entrance, and then we came above ground and retraced our steps above ground and found where we should dig. And we had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program come in, and they started digging, and lo and behold, they found the opening, they opened it and gated it. And when we did that, we cooled the site several degrees. And so 2016 was the first winter that that site was receiving cold air, and it was the lowest number of bats. It had just 7 bats in there that year. It has increased exponentially since then. It quadrupled the first year, going from 7 to 28. It's now up to 230 bats as of last winter. We've doubled the number of species using it, so we've gone from 2 species to 4 species. And this site holds claim to a few other really cool facts. It is now the 3rd largest known hibernation site in the state, and it's also has the largest tricolored bat hibernating population in the state. And tricoloreds are one of those species that the Fish and Wildlife Service just announced would become federally endangered in the future if they push through with what they are proposing. So we've seen some really good things with that. Where we've gone from there, well, we had a strategic plan to manipulate 5 sites, and we have done that. We are now working on our 6th site, and so just moving forward, scaling up. And we've done a variety of different techniques to do this. We've made artificial walls full of concrete and steel in order to trap cold air. We've made earthen mounds, such as in the top right, where the air can't get out of those sites. We've drilled boreholes into sites to vent the heat. We've dug open old air shafts and made vents that way, but the idea is we're trapping the cold air. We're trying to get more cold air into those sites, so more openings to get it in, more ways to keep it in. And we've seen for some of these sites now that have had a couple years under their belt, not only are they getting cooler, but we're seeing the same patterns. We're seeing increase of species, we're seeing total abundance increases as well. One of the other things we're working on, and have been for several years now, is a second tool for white nose syndrome. So with white nose syndrome, there aren't any other tools out there available to managers. So our team not only created the first one by trying to cool these sites, but we've also developed a tool where we can go in and treat the environment with a non-toxic substance. It's called polyethylene glycol 8000, or PEG 8000 for short. It's used ubiquitously all over the landscape, all over the world. It's on every medication, it's in your toothpaste. It's used in the wine industry, all kinds of places. So it's a very common substance, and what it does is it makes fungi act as though they're water stressed. So we go in when the bats aren't there, we treat the environment, we cover all of the spores with this stuff, and the spores just won't germinate. And so we delay exposure to the bats. And the end result is at our treatment site is that we've reduced disease in those bats by 65%. That's an average over 2 years. So this is something that we're hoping will be accepted for publication in the coming months here. It's been submitted, and we're really proud of that, and we've already begun scaling up. We're now at 3 sites that we've treated, and we're looking for more. Not every site will be ideal for performing this, but wherever we can apply this tool, or even both tools at the same time, we think we're going to have some good success for our bats. And then I'm going to switch just real quickly to wood rats. Wood rats are also in decline. So, you know, we would be lucky if we were only dealing with problems with bats. Unfortunately, we're not. We have other species of concern, and wood rats are fast approaching that emergency room level. So right now we're looking at over 70% loss of all of our active wood rat sites. We're down to just a couple few strongholds, what we call metapopulations that are left. We lost an entire metapopulation called the Pine Creek metapopulation. That was lost just last year, and we're seeing nothing but declines for the most part. So we've been working for the last couple years trying to create as many different tools as we can and figure out what is working, what works the best out of everything we've tried at different places and why. So we've gone through looking at genetics. We've been moving individuals around. So you have a transmitted wood rat on the top left there. And so that was a female that we grabbed from Fayette County and moved that up to Blair County. And we've been trying to create extra denning areas and connectors. So one of the problems with wood rats is fragmentation. So we're trying to get them so they can have movement, have a little bit larger colony size, which would make them more stable. We're planting favorite food items. We're supplementally feeding them. We're doing helminth baiting, trying to get rid of these parasites that are affecting them. So with wood rats, you don't have just one thing like a disease. You have a whole host of problems causing all these declines. And so we're trying to address as many of those as we can, all at the same time. As Lisa would put it, it's almost like a living laboratory where we're out there seeing what works. And as that gets figured out, we're trying to use that and deploy those at those last remaining sites that are kind of our last strongholds. And so with that, I will take any questions if we have any, and if not.
I just have one question.
Sure.
On average, how many offspring do bats have each year?
So, of all the hibernating bats that we have those 6 species. 5 of those 6 have 1 pup per year.
Just one.
Just 1 per year. The one species of bat that has 2 happens to be the one species that is least impacted by white nose syndrome and has become our most common bat because of that.
Which bat is that?
That would be the big brown bat.
Big brown bat, okay. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Very much.
So just to make sure that I understood you correctly, we've kind of taken a 2-step approach, if you will, for these bats, where the first one is cooling hibernaculums, correct? And then you've identified 2 or 3 of those areas and treated them with that PEG 8000. So that puts, in my mind, with my limited knowledge of bats, but looking at what's coming down the pike from Fish and Wildlife, I mean, Pennsylvania is literally the tip of the iceberg in leading the charge in coming up with a solution for really an international wildlife crisis. So kudos to you guys and your division for taking the charge on that. Something to be proud of.
All right, good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Sean Murphy. I am the state's ornithologist for the Game Commission. I oversee the protected bird section. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. Lisa touched on this a little bit, and it's rather specific with our bird diversity in Pennsylvania. The state is blessed with more than 200 breeding species. 90 of those have been identified as species of greatest conservation need. 20 of those are found on the threatened and endangered list. And we're fortunate to say that 3 of those have been identified as recovered populations. I have the unique privilege to lead an incredibly unique team from within our bureau and other bureaus, the biologists across all the regions. But in particular, for a lot of the bird work we do, every project, the 2 that I'll touch on today, and pretty much every one that we work on has a significant and valuable component that comes from volunteers across the state. And so oftentimes I look at the bird team for the agency as including that birding community and wildlife watchers across the state. Before I move into it, the bird on the screen there is the yellow-crowned night heron. It's one, I'm a bit biased, it's one of the more striking birds in Pennsylvania. This bird's on our endangered species list, primarily based on the fact that we're on the edge of its range. The Susquehanna River Valley is kind of this unusual pocket for some of these colonial water birds, like the yellow-crowned night heron. More peculiar about this species is that there's about 12 to 20 nests per year, and they're found in one location in the state, and it's right here in downtown Harrisburg, and it's a pretty phenomenal urban endangered species. So if you're ever spring, early summer, if you're in the Harrisburg area, reach out to me. I'll take you down and look at some of these nests because it's pretty phenomenal. The public engagement at these sites is pretty incredible. It really brings a lot of different pieces together for bird conservation. So today I'll be touching on 2 projects that have had kind of monumental 2022s. That said, currently we have projects that are probably touching bird conservation with more than 50 species in the state. So this is just a scratch of the surface for bird conservation in the program that the agency is leading. We'll touch on the inaugural year of a statewide survey launched by the Game Commission for our newly listed northern goshawk, and then we will take a look at a historical year for the piping plover, a federally endangered species. And if it's not a species I'm speaking about, like this female American kestrel, it's typically because we have a rather significant project going on. So we have a project in partnership with Hawk Mountain looking at population declines of this bird, both in Pennsylvania and across the eastern United States. So first up is the northern goshawk. Probably, at least when it happened, it was in October of last year, it was our most recent listed species in Pennsylvania, unless a plant or non-bird or mammal has surpassed them as the most recent addition to the list. This is a large secretive forest raptor. It's found in mature mixed forest stands. It has a diverse diet, typically feeding on small mammals in the forest, game birds, as well as larger passerines. Declines have been well documented across the eastern United States and in provincial Canada. And let's see, we have, so since listing in October 21, kind of the immediate action that takes place, thanks to the board for approving that listing, the two actions that take place right when that becomes law is that we developed and refined best management practices. So when these known nesting in some of the historical areas for northern goshawks overlap with project development, there are best management practices put forward to avoid, reduce, or mitigate disturbance to the breeding birds. So that's something that happened right away with passing of the listing. It also limited falconry take, so that removes an added piece that may be potentially causing some of its declines. But in addition to the in addition to the immediate protection of these birds once they join the list of threatened and endangered species, is to actually think about the conservation of the bird. So we immediately established a statewide survey. There were methods that were developed with the Game Commission in partnership with Penn State University to develop a novel monitoring technique. And that took place in 2022. We've also continued to support work being done for goshawks in the Allegheny National Forest, which at this point is looked at as their core habitat within the state of Pennsylvania. And we're also thick in development of relevant research, both within the state and in the regions. So looking more at the eastern North American population of goshawks. And we're continuing to refine our recovery plan. So the statewide goshawk survey, the first year of its kind, was this past season. This is biologist Patty Barber and Southeast region biologist Dan Mummert deploying an autonomous recording unit, or an ARU. These ARUs kind of work as monitors that never go away. So as long as the batteries and the data card is available, it will record sounds in the surrounding areas, and you can set a schedule so it's recording at peak times when we know northern goshawks would be vocalizing. And so if you have a goshawk in the area, typically this would be late February into March, and courtship begins and they start making a lot of noise. So they're calling to each other. Those are picked up on the ARU. The ARUs are then quickly taken back and processed, identified for any calls from northern goshawks. If a call is detected, then we mobilize a local team of biologists to go out and do nest searching. So then we'll go out and look for potential nests that would be associated with that calling bird. So in this pilot year, we had 12 ARUs to deploy. We conducted over 30 surveys across Pennsylvania. And in 2022, those 30 surveys resulted in 3 territories. Of those 3 territories, 1 active nest, which ultimately produced 2 fledglings. Now, it seems like, well, that's a lot of work for 3 territories across the state. But, you know, based on our recent efforts leading up to the listing, it appears that anywhere, you know, for the past 7 or 8 years, you're detecting anywhere between 1 nest up to maybe 10 or 12. So our population is significantly reduced. So any nest we can find is valuable information and the ability to then protect that habitat. But what might be more interesting to highlight in the 2022 season is that nest that we did find. As I mentioned, it successfully raised 2 young. But with partnerships with a goshawk biologist from Maryland, and that photo to the right, Andrew DeSalvo, our wildlife veterinarian here at the Game Commission, we were able to trap the female at this location. We color banded the individual so that we'll know if she gets resighted. If she returns next year and they have pretty strong fidelity to their nest locations, we'll know that that's her. But in that third image, she was also inoculated for West Nile virus. West Nile virus has been well documented to be impacting raptor populations across North America. The data is somewhat incidental for goshawks right now, but the data does suggest that they're rather vulnerable to this virus. And so we worked with federal partners to gain rapid approval and inoculate this bird. We'll continue to push this. This is something that, to our knowledge, this is the first time this has ever been done to a wild, free-ranging northern goshawk. Some falconers have done it. We continue to push this. If we find more nests, we'll continue this process. And in addition, we're developing a research project that would really fine-tune what kind of value this will have at a population level. So switching species from our newest state listed to now one of our favorite federally listed bird in the state, the piping plover. This marks the 6th consecutive year that the federally endangered piping plover has successfully nested and raised young in the state of Pennsylvania. And this is a beach nesting shorebird. So that takes us to our beautiful beaches along the Lake Erie coastline. And if we expand out, we're in Presque Isle State Park, operated and managed by DCNR, and in particular, Gull Point, which is that sandbar that you see extend at the end of Presque Isle State Park. So in 2022, we had 3 federally endangered piping plovers nest at Presque Isle. What I want you to pay attention to in this figure is we have our years since we've had piping plovers along the x-axis. Along the y are number of birds. The black line are the number of pairs of adult piping plovers. So you can see for 2021 and 22, we've hit 3 pairs on our beaches. But what I want you to take particular notice to is the sharp increase in young produced this year. So we had 9 chicks fledged, 4 were transferred to wildlife captive rearing due to nest abandonment by one of the adults. But those chicks are then released and become part of the Great Lakes piping plover population, which currently sits at about 75 pairs for that population. So you look and you think 3 pairs, 9 chicks fledged, that doesn't seem like that very many. But when you're thinking about a population that's being managed at 75 pairs across all the Great Lakes, that's a pretty significant contribution. And each season, an expert team of PGC biologists and partners go out and color band these piping plovers so that we can identify them later, like this young feathery bird here. Dons a federal band as well as color bands, and then they're seen in other parts, whether it's during the winter in Florida or the Gulf Coast or Bahamas or somewhere lovely, better than the Lake Erie coast in December. And then they return. And to date, let me make sure I get this number right, 4 of our 18 banded Pennsylvania piping plover chicks have been sighted at other breeding locations in the Great Lakes. So we know at least of 4 that are now contributing breeding adults to this critically endangered population. And in fact, one of them last year was found as a nester, had a nest in Ohio, which was the first piping plover nest in the state of Ohio in 83 years. So our Pennsylvania young kind of pioneered back into Ohio and has brought the piping plover back to another state in the Great Lakes. So pretty monumental past couple years for piping plovers. And of course, I do have to throw this up because piping plovers and Presque Isle State Park are both incredibly unique to Pennsylvania. And, this just goes to show that industry, the birding community, and the general public have a vested interest in birds. They have a vested interest in conservation. And this is just a note and a cheers to a great 22 season for piping plovers. So I'm just going to close with thinking again how Lisa started us off with this idea of prevention, protection, rehabilitation, all these different angles that we take at conservation. With birds, we have prevention like wood thrush. It's a species that, you walk through any forest in Pennsylvania and you hear a wood thrush. It's kind of, I consider it the soundtrack of Penn's Woods. Wood thrush are common, but we are responsible for about 10% of the world's population. We're the second we're the number 2 state for housing breeding wood thrush. And so we do a lot to keep them common because that has a bigger influence on a species that's declining across its range. The middle slide is recovery. Last year we celebrated over 40, nearly 50 years of conservation work to recover peregrine falcons in Pennsylvania, and we continue to usher that species into the recovered era. And lastly, the golden wing warbler that's been touched on a few times through our presentations today. The golden wing warbler has a disjunct population in the Appalachia region. We're owners of about 30% of that population. And as has been presented, young forest is being created across Pennsylvania, and one of those targeted species are golden wing warblers. So restoring that habitat and hoping to recruit that species back to those forest stands is a critical mission for us. And so I think, bird conservation is steaming along. As I mentioned, we have several other projects. I look forward to the next time I can stand up here and present on another species or group of species that we're doing some serious work on. And with that, I'll take any questions. And as the last presentation and a good show and tell, in the hand is better than a photo. So I have one of these to pass around and take a look at the piping plover IPA. So with that, any questions?
Sean, I have a couple.
Yes.
You inoculated the northern goshawk female. Did you, or were you able to inoculate the fledglings, or was that a no-no, or?
It's a great question. It's a terrific question. So, perfect scenario, we went there with the intent to inoculate male, female, and the 2 fledglings. When we arrived at the site, initially a goshawk biologist from Maryland went in. His name's David Brinker. Took a look and said, oh, the chicks look a little old. They're a little jumpy. So as just like peregrine chicks, when we go to work on peregrine chicks and do health checks with them, as they get older and older, they get a little bit more brave, and that's dangerous because they might leap, and they might not be ready to fledge. We would call it forced fledging. So this nest is 50 feet up in a tree, and we don't want to cause a disturbance that would result in those young jumping out and falling down. So the decision was made at that point that we wouldn't go for the young. We would just leave them be and let them, hopefully see them through to fledging. So then to catch the adults, they use a trap down on the ground. It's got a lure with an owl, and the bird flies down and gets caught in a net. So that was set up. And typically when this intruder comes onto their territory, one adult, typically the male, will then come back to the nest, and the female goes to defend the territory. So the female came down and got caught, so we were able to get her, and then by the length of time that we used, we called it not to catch the male and just moved on. So it was, we got 1 out of 4, which aren't great odds, but it was a huge step in kind of working out that process for future opportunities.
A second question is, last fall after the September board meeting, we met with a couple of the falconers, the president of the Pennsylvania Falconers.
Yeah, Pennsylvania Hawk. Yeah.
Pardon?
Mm-hmm.
What was his name?
It's a Pennsylvania Hawk and Falcon and Hawk Trust.
But anyway, at that point, we were trying to convince them to relay to us some of their nesting sites that they were aware of. Did that ever happen, or?
That never quite came to fruition, but I will note that one of the ARUs that we were able to purchase this year was donated by the Hawk Trust. So they actually put together a fundraiser, and one of those ARUs are a little bit bigger than some of the other ones we use, and they cost about $1,000, and they were able to put a fundraiser together and make a donation to purchase one of those. So they're still actively part of this mission to help the goshawk.
Interesting, because they said there were at least 7 nests that they were aware of, that they knew where they were, but weren't really willing to share that information with us.
Yeah, we were not unable to get the information, but the 30 sites we put out were at historical locations that we have records for over the past maybe 15 or 20 years. In fact, that nest we found was one that no bird has been detected there, I think, since 2004. So it's been quite some time. So it was great to have that ARU get out there. It's out there every morning, you know, rain or shine, and got that detection and turned into a nest. But sure, certainly if, you know, when we get them from the public or from falconers, if we get records of possible goshawk observations during the breeding season, we will certainly send somebody out to take a look.
All right, thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Mike, I have a question. Sean, you're getting my very first public question.
All right.
And maybe not a difficult one. What triggers or what gives you the information on the decline of, you know, these various species? And obviously from the federal level, probably getting it from different sources. But I know we've got a lot of, you know, bird organizations here in the state. But what gives us, the agency, that information?
That's a great question. I'll pull something up right here that for the sake of brevity, was removed from our presentation. But when we look to list the goshawk, it's a secretive bird. So it's, you know, I would say the first tip-off for a lot of the species in Pennsylvania is every 20 years we do something called a breeding bird atlas. You think again about relevancy and our engagement with the public. The bird atlas has over 2,000 volunteers submit data for that publication, for that work. And it's a monumental effort. And when the second one was done from 2004 to 2009, biologists at the time with the Game Commission looked at declines of certain species from Atlas 1 to Atlas 2 and kind of it was roughly about a 25% cutoff. Like if there was a decline of 25% of occupancy across the state, they took a close look at, you know, could we identify why that's happening? Do we feel confident in that trend? Goshawks had a decline about that at that level, but it's a cryptic bird. It's kind of hard to find. It only calls really early in the season. So the thought was, well, we got to look harder. So that's what we did. The Ornithological Technical Committee, along with the Game Commission, Hawk Mountain, and Penn State University, put together some statewide surveys to really gather some more information. Well, that information fell right in line with more of the regional stuff, which is up on the slide here. So there's migratory raptor index numbers that show declines. There's Christmas bird count that shows declines in goshawks. So, you know, it was the body of evidence in this case that allowed us to feel confident in making that decision. Of course, if an animal is federally listed, that immediately triggers a state listing. But yeah, and of course, every species is different in birds, mammals, to really kind of, you got to get into the weeds about what data is available and use the best science to make the best decisions.
Thank you.
That was a great question.
Thank you.
Any more? All right, thank you all for your time.
That concludes this meeting. Thank you, everybody.